Hey everybody, welcome to Common Core with the Classics with me, Mr. B. I need to think of a new dumb joke to start the show with, but before we can get to that, we're going to talk about Rising Action with one of my favorite games of all time, Castlevania. Alright, Castlevania is a great game. Castlevania games have been around since, as you can see on the screen there, 1987. They're based on vampire Dracula kind of lore. It's all about fighting and killing Dracula. So last week we talked about the introduction to your story, and for this game in particular, I'm going to show you how this one has a pretty bad introduction in just a second here. There's really no story that comes at the beginning of the screen. At least Legend of Zelda had something, but this one has nothing. I'm going to read you what it does have in the instruction manual, though, and it really doesn't have much to do with the actual lore of Castlevania, but I'll talk about that in just a second. So here's what they say. So, introduction, good evening. Step into the shadows of the deadliest dwelling on Earth. You've arrived at Castlevania, and you're here on business, to destroy forever the curse of the evil Count. Unfortunately, everybody's home this evening. Bats, ghosts, every kind of creature you can imagine. You'll find them all over the place if they don't find you first. Because you've got to get through 6 monstrous floors before you even meet up with the master of the house. Your magic whip will help, and you'll probably find a weapon or two along the way. But once you make it to the tower, you can count on a duel to the death. The Count has waited 100 years for a rematch. He's ready. Are you? Not a great intro. A little bit silly, especially considering the subject of matter of the game. It's like all monsters and crazy, ghouly ghosts and everything. Actually, there aren't any ghosts. Not in this one. Anyhow, there is one piece that I don't want to dwell on introductions again because we just talked about those last week's, but I think that there is one little sentence in there that would work well for an intro. If all you had as the intro is, "The Count has waited 100 years for a rematch. He's ready. Am I?" That would be a great way to start your story. But anyway, today we're talking about Rising Action. Rising Action is basically anything that happens between the introduction and the climax of your story. It's all of the little climaxes and all of the little steps that happen along the way to your climax. So all of the different obstacles that your protagonist has to clear to get all the way to their goal, they're all going to fall within the realm of Rising Action. Rising Action is generally the longest part of your story because your character, for it to be really a good conflict-based story, is going to have a lot of things that they need to do to solve their problem. And so the Rising Action becomes the most important or the biggest part of your story. I'd say the climax is probably still the most important part of the story, but the Rising Action is probably going to take up the bulk of your story. And this is especially clear when we're talking about video games because especially in a game that's structured the way that old school games are, where you have 6 or 7 or 8 different levels before you get to the end. All of those different little levels are the Rising Action of the game. And you'll notice that in most games it gets harder as you go along. Just like when we look at those, and my camera goes like in reverse, so I have to like watch what I'm doing here. So as you go up the Rising Action, which goes up to a point there at the top where your climax is, everything keeps going up the mountain and it gets harder as you go, and things get more and more interesting as you go along. And so when you're writing your story, you want to make sure that you have Rising Action that really builds up and builds up. We're going to talk a little bit more about that build a little bit later. But for right now, let's get to the game. As much as I didn't like their written introduction to the game, or, within the realm of the game, there wasn't one. But as much as I didn't like their introduction to the game, they do have a really cool scene that starts you off for this game. So let's take a look. Here we go. So like I said, not a lot of introduction here, but look at this. This is awesome. This is just super cool. Like, oh man, there's the castle. Oh, look at that specter of a cloud. Okay, now they don't really give you much to go on from the start here. And so you kind of have to make your own decision. So, okay, if I'm pushing the buttons, this is what stuff happens. Okay, ooh, I whipped that thing and it gave me a thing. All right, so this is the start of the rising action. Ah, I got a cool weapon. That's exciting. That's going to help me get towards my goal. Oh, I got an even bigger one. Oh, that's even cooler. Look at me, I can whip stuff. One thing that you'll notice, and there's actually a really, really great video online about this. I think it's Sequelitis. Does a whole thing. There's some, mildly inappropriate language in there. But it's all about how video games sort of taught you back in the day. And so like this one, you push the start button and you're given a guy. Now the Nintendo controller was really easy because there were really only 4 different buttons and then the control pad. So back then it was easy to just like, what does this one do? What does that one do? What happens if I hit start? Oh, it freezes everything. What happens if I hit select? Oh, nothing. Great. So they did a really great job of, you just kind of learn it because it's so simple, you can do that. Oh, now I got a new weapon too. Awesome. Oh, I'm timed. I better get going. Here's a little secret here. You can jump past there. Oh, if you jump back, you can get the gold. So now I'm in the castle, and already my rising action picks up again. I've got all kinds of zombies coming at me. So I need to pick up the pace, and I'm already thrust into a difficult situation. So I'm already having the conflict that I'm experiencing is starting to rise already. And then here again we have another conflict, little mini conflict, part of a rising action as a panther, which is so totally part of Dracula lore. I'm so glad they put a panther in there because that makes so much sense. But more rising action, new enemies, new obstacles to defeat. For your rising action, you kind of want to keep things changing. You don't want things to be stagnant. Stagnant is like when things are just not really exciting. Nothing new or interesting is happening. But just like on the plot diagram, that rising action is a diagonal line going up. That means that things need to keep going and keep changing. You don't want it to be boring, right? There's nowhere in that plot diagram a spot where it says, okay, be boring. So continuing on, I've got some bats that are coming at me. Here's another little secret if you didn't know this. In Castlevania, you always want to try to whip the walls because there will be meat inside of the walls. It's kind of a running joke for Castlevania fans. Now, I really was hoping I wouldn't die at all for this one, but I don't think it's going to happen. So next in my rising action, we've already had like 3 different changes of setting within the rising action of this game. It's part of why I wanted to use this one because they really do atmosphere and tone and mood really well. Clearly we're in kind of like a dungeon now, and so they set it up so it actually looks like that. I think if I kneel here, yep, that's how I get the gold. Early video games were so weird. Like, if you want extra points, hit this brick, go down there, and then crouch for a second, and then you'll get a thing. I could really use some meat right now. Oh, but as I was saying, so in this game so far, we've already gone through 4 different environments. We had the outside of the castle and the atmosphere of it being spooky and nighttime and blah, blah, blah. Then we moved on to, like, the entry hall, which we're kind of going back into now. Then you had the weird sort of tower dungeon room that takes you down to, like, Dracula's sewer, which I suppose is kind of another weird, like, I don't remember reading in Bram Stoker's Dracula about Dracula's sewer. Oh, I missed something. For this boss here, you really want the axe. So I'm going to get that. So I'm already at the climax of this level. The climax is going to be the boss fight. The boss fight here is going to be with a giant bat. And so here we go with the giant bat. I think there's meat here. No, there we go. Now this guy is super easy as long as you just use the axe. The axe always flies in an... I should probably start using it if I'm going to say it's important. The axe always flies in a parabolic motion. Math geeks. Always flies in a parabolic motion. And so it's great for hitting enemies that are up in the sky. So I'm going to pause here just for a second so we can talk about what just happened. So just like we see on our plot diagram, this is so goofy. Just like we see on the plot diagram, our rising action has to go up and up and up. And so as we went through that level, things became a little bit more and more treacherous. But there were little steps on our way to get to that bat that the programmers put in there so that we'd have things to do to increase the stakes of the story as we went along. So we've got, first of all, we have the excitement of getting a new weapon right away at the beginning and being so cool and awesome. And then we moved on to the zombies coming right at you. Excitement. And then you've got panthers that are jumping all over you. And I think I probably killed them too fast for you to see. But their motion was to jump all over you and try to get you that way. Then we go down into a sewer. More exciting. You get these weird fish guys who are jumping out of the water and shooting fireballs at you. You go back up and there's bats everywhere trying to get you. Then you've got more zombies on the way to a giant bat fight. Okay? That is an exciting rise. Other way. Rise in the action of the story. And so within this self-contained level, we have all of this, the good steps of a story that's going to lead you to a climax. Now, obviously this is not the end of the game. We did not just kill Dracul. So I'm going to play on for a little bit more just so we can talk about even within the structure of a video game, you have little climaxes that build up to the final climax. And that's really what's contained in your rising action as well. If you read a book that has chapters, generally speaking, and I'm going to keep going here, generally speaking, each chapter is going to be kind of its own self-contained rising action and a climax. There's always going to be a reason why that chapter is a self-contained part of the book. And so within a story's structure, you have multiple different almost complete story diagrams. You've got an introduction, a rising action, a climax, falling action, and conclusion. Generally, in a longer work, the falling action and the conclusion are going to be a little bit different and not non-existent, but a little bit harder to pinpoint. And it's not really a true resolution because obviously there's more story going on. Anywho, so your story structure, and I'm going to show this once I beat this level, is really going to look like a mountain range that's all going further and further up into the air. Because you've got so many different things going on in your story that all lead up to one part. But it's not just one clear through line. You've got different parts coming together to make that happen. You can see I have the cool cross weapon. Super awesome weapon. Probably the most helpful weapon in all of Castlevania. Followed by one of the most annoying enemies in all of Castlevania. I'll talk just a little bit about the Castlevania series just for a second here. Castlevania is all about Dracula. There have been a ton of different games. There was Castlevania 1, which is this one, Simon's Quest, which was the second one, and we're actually going to look at that just for a minute to show you how they totally do not handle the rising action well. Then you've got Castlevania 3, which some people view as the high point of the series. It is definitely very good. It also introduced the character of Alucard, Dracula's son, who would go on to star in one of the later games and one of my favorite games of all time. But then there were 3 Castlevania Game Boy games, 2 or 3. One of them had you playing as a girl Belmont for the first time. I think her name was Sonia, which was really cool. Not a lot of games at that time were letting you play as a girl. I mean, you had Metroid, and they didn't even let you know she was a girl until you got all the way to the end. So it was really cool to have a game where you could play as a female Belmont. That's probably the last time in the series they let... Well, you can play as Maria in one of the games. Anyhow, so then the series went to Super Castlevania 4, which was great. That was one of the first games for Super Nintendo. Oh, See, now if you remember the things like that from Mega Man 2, they just hurt you. These ones will kill you in one spot. So there's death count 1 for today's episode. As I was saying, Super Castlevania 4 had a really cool part to it. You could swing on little like hooks to swing around a level. There was a new cool technology in Super Nintendo called Mode 7. And Mode 7 allowed them to take like a picture and make that the backdrop for like a layer of the screen that could then rotate and move, not in 3D. I mean, it was kind of like 3D. That's how the first Mario was made. But Konami, the makers of this game, found a really cool application for it, and they had a room in the castle where there was like a hook in the middle of the room, but that you could hook your whip to hang from. Oh, there's ghosts. But the whole room would spin around you. It was so super cool. You should definitely play it if you haven't, and I'm assuming you probably haven't. There was also Dracula X for Super Nintendo, which was actually based on a PC Engine game that came out in Japan called Rondo of Blood. We're at another boss here. Rondo of Blood. Rondo of Blood had a direct sequel later, but before that there was Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis, which was a really great game. It was really bizarre because you didn't actually play as a Belmont. You played as, because most of the games are all about this one bloodline, one clan who fights vampires all the time. Like, they're the ones who are supposed to kill Dracula. And so this was the first one. You could be John Morris. You had 2 playable characters too, which was cool. You could play as John Morris, who was a normal whip guy, and then there was Eric Lacard, I think was his name. And he had this cool like spear halberd thing. So he was kind of awesome. After that, you had Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is the hands down best Castlevania game of all time. It really mixed up the formula because you were playing as Alucard, who's Dracula's son, going through to try to banish and stop the resurrection of his father. Very, very awesome game. It introduced more RPG elements. You could get different weapons, including one called the Chrysogrim, which was like the total game-breaking game. It was a sword that just made like 12 different slashes go out in front of you within the span of like half a second. So it just decimated anything you came up. It's 2 deaths. Anything you came up against, it just decimated. There were 2 mostly forgettable Nintendo 64 games. Castlevania 64, and I think the other one was like Legacy of Darkness. I didn't play them. I didn't have a Nintendo 64. I felt like I just didn't care for it. Didn't like it. The controller was just too wonky for me. Trying to think. If I'm going through the whole chronology, it's going to be a minute. On PlayStation 2, there was Lament of Innocence, and I think it was Curse of Darkness. Both of those were meh. Really, one of the coolest times in the Castlevania franchise, they happened on the Nintendo DS, or the Game Boy Advance, and then the Nintendo DS. They took a lot of what made Castlevania Symphony of the Night great and just put it into a handheld, which was awesome. There was Circle of the Moon, and then Harmony of Dissonance, I think, and then Aria of Sorrow, followed by Dawn of Sorrow, and then Portrait of Ruin, and Order of Ecclesia. Now, after that point, Castlevania sort of fell off the map for a while. It came back with Castlevania Lords of Shadows, which I absolutely hated. It moved away from a lot of the cool stuff that the series had always done, and instead made it basically a God of War ripoff that wasn't as good. And the story was like super melodramatic and blah. They followed that up with a 3DS title called Mirror of Fate that was a direct sequel to Lords of Shadow, which means obviously I didn't care for it. 2 deaths. And Lords of Shadow was relatively commercially successful, and so they did make a sequel that, by all accounts, was god awful. I mean, I didn't play it. I played through Lords of Shadow just because I was like, man, I gotta at least, try to get through this. I'm such a Castlevania fan. But I didn't care for it. So I didn't play the second one, because whatever. And there hasn't been another Castlevania game since then. I think that they probably killed the franchise. When they moved over to Lord of Shadow, it's worth noting that the guy who had been in charge of the series for a while, kind of the Keiji Inafune of Mega Man, would be like the Igarashi of Castlevania. And so Igarashi left the project. I think he's not with Konami anymore, and I think he was talking about kickstarting a project, which, obviously I was... if you know anything about me, if Keiji Inafune is doing anything, I'll kickstart it or back it or whatever. Same thing with Iga. When Iga comes out with his Kickstarter, I'll definitely be on board for that. Anyhow, I'm going to use the clock because I'm tired of these things killing me. And there's a boss battle coming up pretty quick. I'm probably going to die a third time, and I'm not going to want to continue, I don't think, because, yeah. So we'll move on to our next segment here. We're going to talk about all of the great Rising Action things that they did in this game, and how the second game in the Castlevania series really just kind of ruined all of that. So, short little intermission here as I switch to Castlevania Simon's Quest. Alright, here we are back with Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. This was a direct sequel. Came out the next year. They do give you some background here. Step into the shadows of the Hell House. You've arrived back here. We'll wait for that to scroll back around again. In this game, it doesn't say it really explicitly here, but you are cursed. Simon's cursed. You have to save the day. And again, you're destroying the curse of Dracula. In this game, it was kind of weird, though. First of all, they have a password, which is funky. But it's an open-ended game. This was one of the first really open-world games that I can really think of outside of some obscure PC games. And for someone who was playing Nintendo back in the day, it was totally would blow your mind. Okay, so if you remember the last time, we started out and there was one way to go, and we had our buttons. And let's do a button check real quick here. Okay, that. I don't know what any of that means. 1242. It's not 1242. I don't get that. E, L. I don't know what any of that means. L whip. So I'm excited. I'm like, oh man, where do I whip the thing to get the next thing? Do I whip this guy? Oh no, he's going to say something. A crooked trader is offering bum deals in this town. Okay, thank you. I guess that's kind of interesting. I can go in here. What does this person say? I suppose my point here is there's really no direction. The game isn't really pointing you in any clear way. One of the things that makes open world games so successful and popular now is that they have a really clear sense of how to get around. You've got a map, you've got all that stuff. What does this guy want? Buy a white crystal. I guess if I'm listening to that other guy, I should say no. Now, I know what I need to do because I've played this game before, but back in the day, it was all about talking to your friends and finding out what you need to do. We need holy water. That is a requirement. Now, in the last game, you just hold up and hit the button to make the holy water go. It doesn't work that way anymore. You have all kinds of different things, so you have to select it, and then you can throw your holy water. But you're just in this town. There's no direction. There's nothing that tells you what to do. If you've read the instruction manual, you do know a few things. Clues to Dracula's riddle are in the town of Varos. Okay, I don't know what Dracula's riddle is. One of the things that this game is infamous for is having a really awful English translation. A magic potion will destroy the wall of evil. Like I said, bad translation. What they're really talking about there is the fact that holy water can be used to break bricks. Much more difficult to... Oh, God. Okay, so... What am I... Okay, so... Holy water, maybe? Oh. And so the rising action of this game... I'm guessing maybe I'm not supposed to go that way because they killed me too fast. There really hadn't been a ton of points in games that I had played where you go a direction and it's too hard, so you realize you have to go a different way. Oh, and then what is this crap? What a horrible night to have a curse. What does that mean? Oh. Oh, that means it's nighttime? Okay. It's just really not clear what the build-up to my climax is going to be. Yeah. Now, like I said, I know what needs to happen. And if you've read the instruction manual, you know the weird thing about this game is that Dracula has been defeated but in the first game, but his curse still plagues the land, so you have to defeat him again in a way that totally gets rid of him forever, which obviously, since there are so many sequels, doesn't work. But the process is you have to go and find all of these different parts of Dracula, the heart of Dracula, the rib of Dracula, the eye of Dracula, and once you have all those, you take them to his castle, and you can resurrect him and then defeat him again once and for all. But there's really just no clear direction or understanding of what to do. The general rule of this time was just keep moving to the right when you're playing a game, and so you kind of go that route. But there's so many different weird things, like we'll count that as 4. We'll count this as deaths too. Oh. See, now I died all the way. I can continue or I can get my password. Oh, and it starts me right back at the same place, which is weird too. So I know that I'm supposed to move right. I think that's what I was talking about. But other than that, I really don't know what is going on, and I just kind of keep seeing new stuff. It's difficult to tell what the goal is. Like, what is it that I'm really trying to do right now? I need to find 5 things, but it's not the normal order of a game that I'd played in the past where it's like, do the first level, get the first thing. Do the second level, get the second thing. There's just a lot about this game that's convoluted. We've got the branching pathway right there, which I'm not going to go down that way because I know where I'm supposed to go. There's just a lot of really tricky parts that are like, how do I do this without getting hurt? Even worse, I just remembered this. I'm not going to go too far into this first castle. But there's just floors that are invisible or visible but aren't there. Like right here. You don't know this because you don't have my knowledge. But there's a floating platform there. If you bought the white crystal from the guy who was supposedly a crook, then you see that there's a platform there. So already the game is giving you information that is not correct. The guy told me that the seller was a crook. But I needed that white crystal unless I knew the trick to do that. Now that was actually the first time I did the smart trick. Ordinarily I just kind of would randomly jump and hope for the best. But this time I went a little bit out over the edge of the platform and jumped up, and that did it. So this castle is relatively straightforward. Part of the problem of this game and its rising action, even if we take into account, okay, so I figured out I have to go this way. That's rising action. Get to the castle, go up and do through the castle. Unlike the first game, which had these awesome bosses, there are no bosses. The climax of this castle is really anticlimactic. There was a weird thing in this game where rather than having bosses at the quote-unquote end of these castles, instead of that, and I think this is where we have our first invisible floors. I think this pillar is the first one. No, maybe not. You can use holy water to figure this out. That's why your money is best spent on holy water rather than the white crystal. What was I saying? Instead of see, there's an invisible floor. Instead of fighting a boss and, you know, really having a cool sense of victory to wrap up this mansion and this castle, instead of that, you have to buy a stake, first of all, from this weird dude who hangs out with wooden stakes in an old mansion. And you have to buy the stake from him, and then you just shoot the stake into this crystal ball, and you get the Dracula's part. Ridiculous. I mean, that is not a climactic build in your story. Terrible rising action in this game. Now, I will say that ultimately, this game really set a blueprint for Symphony of the Night. In this game, you've got kind of an open world to explore. You can level up. That's what the E on the screen is you do get experience. You get money in the form of hearts, different weapons. And so there is some value to look back at this game as a precursor to Simon's Quest. Or not Simon's Quest, Symphony of the Night. But it is still kind of a garbage trash game. That said, my buddies and I played this so much. We just love the franchise. It's a great game. Now I'm going to show you just all the way to our first stake here, and then that'll wrap up the episode for today. You can see that dude is down there, just hangs out in a castle, ready to sell you crap, which is bizarre. Now, one thing, the only penalty you get when you continue is, I'm pretty sure the only penalty is you lose all of your hearts, which are the currency of this wacky world. So you have to be careful because you have to pay for the stake. I think they're kind of, I want to say they're either 50 or 100 hearts to get, which is kind of pricey. So you got to make sure you're not dying, falling down pits onto weird skeletons that are throwing bones at you. That guy, come down this way. There's a lot of atmosphere in this game, but it's just wasted. It's wasted on a directionless story. And so it kind of shows you can have the coolest world or the coolest setting, and if you don't tell your story in a good way, it's not going to be that exciting. Okay, only 50. That's not too bad. Okay. Now here's the thing. When you get the whole... Oh, these are clues for Dracula. Destroy the curse, and you'll rule Bram's mansion. What? Okay, so I guess I got to destroy the curse. Okay. This must be Bram's mansion. So I'm thinking, oh, I guess I get to fight Bram. That'll be exciting. Wrong. As I was saying, you can have all the atmosphere in the world. The music for this game is some of the best music, and really kicked off a legacy in this series of having amazing, amazing music. But it's just so directionless. It's hard to really get too invested in it. Especially at the time, there really wasn't a ton of, at least console games that were open-ended like this. And so it just confused the heck out of us when we were kids. And when you're writing a story, the last thing you want to do is confuse the reader. Unless for some reason you're doing that on purpose. I have an old rule that... you know, you'll read some books sometimes. Oh, no. That sends you, like, all the way back to the beginning of the castle. That's another thing. This non-linear castle is a pain in my rump. So, we'll get back there. I don't want to skip ahead, because I always hate when Let's Play type things do that. Like, you should have to suffer through my agony. Oh, well, at least I'll get a bunch of hearts. You definitely want to have a ton of hearts. I usually skip In the first town, you can buy a leather whip, a longer leather whip, but I'll usually skip that and go with a chain whip that you get in a different city. It's short. It's as short as this one, so it's not any longer, but I think it does twice as much damage, so it's worthwhile to pick that one up first. One of the cool things in this game is eventually you get a Morning Star, which is like a longer whip with a ball at the end of it to make it super rad. So you get the Morning Star, and then you can actually get it the Fire Whip, which is on fire. Oddly enough, it's not just a clever name. The platforming in this game is really tricky. One of the things that was especially in early Castlevanias was really frustrating is that you couldn't jump straight up and then move like a little bit. You could only jump that full complete arc. That was it. And so you had to make sure that you were perfectly on the edge of a platform and able to make it to the next, and able to make it to, I feel like that's not the right word, to be able to get to the next spot. Yeah, and able to get to the next spot. I don't know. I need to be in front of students being smart again so I can sound smart again. If you're one of my students watching this and you're like, Mr. B, you didn't sound smart in the first place, please don't post that in the comments. I have feelings. I just looked down at my little selfie box. I got like a couple chins going on at this angle. I gotta find a new selfie angle to do this from so I don't feel bad about my life. Okay, so we're almost to the end here. Since I have a little extra time as I go to this last little goal here, there's one. Now the PlayStation 2 games and the N64 games were not received terribly well. I mean, they weren't fantastic games, and so but they weren't great, but they weren't the total dark spot in the series. The total complete dark spot in the series was a game that they released on Wii, which was called Castlevania Judgment, and I might just have to call it a day on this one. Castlevania Judgment, which was a fighting game, which at first I was like, a fighting game for Castlevania? That could be really rad, because there's a lot of characters within the lore of Castlevania, and so that'd be awesome. Cool fighting game. You get Richter, all the different Belmonts. Super sweet idea. In reality, though, it was awful. They got some kind of terrible character designer to do the character designs. Really weird leather belts and everything for everybody, like weird bondage gear. Really over-sexualized female characters. It was just kind of a hot mess, and just not fun. So that was definitely the low point in the series. I mean, it was things like Maria, who was one of the characters in Rondo of Blood. You save her, and later on she can become a playable character in a few different games. But her whole storyline in the fighting game is I'm trying to remember if this is right, but to become how do I say this in a way that's not terribly inappropriate? She sees one of the other women characters who's very scantily clad and very developed, if we can say that, and so like her whole thing is wanting to be. I think her whole thing is wanting to be developed in that way, which is just bizarre and such a weird thing to do with a character. It seems silly to say this, but they do, for the most part, take the story seriously in these games. I mean, they don't act silly about everything, and so that kind of a silly storytelling was just bizarre and really a low point for women in games. If you know me, you know I follow Anita Sarkeesian and her web series of tropes and Feminist Frequency is the name of her series, and she did Tropes versus Women, which is all about how video games portray women in negative ways. And yeah, that was definitely a low point for women in games. All right, so this is the climax of this castle. All right, watch this. So cool. I throw a dagger at this ball. The ball breaks. There's a sack here. I'll jump up and get it. You now process, which is not a word, Dracula's rib. Okay, I guess I'll show myself out. Just an awful climax to this part of the story. I'm going to put the graphic up on the screen again of, and I'll put this graphic up for the first time. You want your story overall to have really clear, a really clear story development and things going from the rising action and moving up. And this game really just screws that whole idea up. But I'll put this graphic on the screen here. For Castlevania 1, you can see all the different mini climaxes that go over the course of the story that lead you all the way to the final climax with Dracula. So, do like Castlevania 1. Don't do like Castlevania 2. Especially in a story, you need to have direction. It needs to be focused. One cool thing is you can use the rib as a shield, which is kind of cool, but still not great. From here in this game, if you play this, I'm guessing if you're a kid trying to play this now, you're going to want to go find a walkthrough, a Let's Play to watch to see what you need to do, because it's just so weird and convoluted. There's things like you need to take a crystal and go to a certain spot and crouch down, and a tornado will take you away to the next part of the game, which is just ridiculous. How would you ever know that if you weren't like me and my buddies and reading Nintendo Power all the time? You guys are lucky to have the internet. You're also lucky that games aren't dumb like this anymore. Anywho, I think that's going to do it for today's episode of Common Core with the Classics with me, Mr. B. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and you can follow me on Twitter at Right Good or Else. And yeah, other than that, we will see you next time. Don't forget to leave in the comments suggestions for games I can use for storytelling. Obviously, our next one is going to be all about climax. And so with that in mind, I think I'll be looking at some boss battles. And if you have favorite boss battles from classic gaming, you let me know, and maybe we can look at those as a part of our next episode. Other than that, see you next week.